Hi, everybody. My name is Greg Hancock, and along with my friend, with whom I agree 86% of the time, Patrick Curran, we make up Quantitude. We're a podcast dedicated to all things quantitative, ranging from the relevant to the completely irrelevant. In today's episode, we talk about different ways of assessing inter-rater agreement and reliability among two or more raters, and the importance of doing so. Along the way, we also mention the Summer Olympics, underdogs, monologue face-offs, Quincy Wilson, boomers, the Soviet judge, biopsy subjectivity, the secret to college admissions reliability, skipping conference dinners, ripping a dive, Patrick's silver medal, trifactor models, the good cop parent, temper tantrums, and intellectual sugar daddies. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Did you watch the Olympics?
Heck yes, I watched the Olympics. I got them going on my phone. I'm watching clips. We have the TV on in the background. I love watching the Summer Olympics.
I mean, I liked it. I watched a few things with my kids, but I would not say we were an Olympic family. What is the draw to you?
So when I was a kid, I used to participate in junior Olympics kinds of things. So it was always like, oh, the Olympics is the be-all, end-all. It is just so much fun seeing the best of the best in all of these different sports. And sometimes just these underdogs who shine through. I love it. There's like a great story every single day.
Just to clarify, you were Junior Olympics as a drama kid. So was this like a monologue face-off?
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. No, in sports. Yeah, but anyway, I loved the Olympics.
I gotta tell you, my wife got the NBC Peacock thing on that streams, and I was not smart enough to figure the damn interface out. And I spent half my time just trying to find gymnastics.
TV respects me. It laughs with me, not at me.
What was fun is my kids are both involved in sports. Christy is a diver and Jay is a boxer. So we watched a lot of the diving and the boxing. Mostly what we listened to was the two of them argue about the subjectivity of the scoring.
Oh, yeah.
Because your boys are runners.
Exactly right. And we know who wins, even if it's by 100th of a second.
100th of a second. It's 1,000th of a second.
Yeah, I know. It's getting crazy, right?
You dedicate your entire life to this and then lose by 2 1,000ths of a second.
Yeah.
Just a side story that was fun this summer when they were doing the Olympic trials. There was a young kid from Maryland who was like 16 or 17, and he set a new world record for high school students. I sent a text to Tate saying, hey, did you see this? Because it was the same race that Tate competes in. Mm-hmm. And Tate texted back within like 10 seconds a picture of Tate and this kid just hanging out together with a selfie. And Tate was like, yeah, we're friends.
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that's Quincy Wilson, who is just the future of track. And he's only 16. Tate's actually older than this kid who's in the Olympics. It's very, very cool.
Look at this. The kid's coming back. Oh, what a finish from the 16-year-old. The crowd know what they just saw.
And that's because that's another under-18 world record. This kid is phenomenal.
Well, I loved the kid's post-race interview.
I'm just excited for myself. Vernon, he's 32 years old. I'm 16. I'm half of his age. I'm just running for my life when it comes out there.
Right.
I love that. But anyway, so Tate and Quinn get to see who won. But with the diving, the diver would execute whatever they were doing and then come out and then wait an eternity. I don't know how long, like if these guys are going out for coffee or playing Sudoku or whatever. And then they put up the 5 scores and you get an average of the scores. It reminds me, the generation Greg and I are. Greg is a boomer. I'm not. I just want to remind you of
it's
that.
It's a technicality.
I miss being a boomer by 6 months. Back in like the 80s, they would have gymnastics. There would be an American on a panel and there would be a Soviet on the panel. And they would call out the scores and it would be like 9.8, 9.7, 9.2, 5.1, 9.7. So there would always be these wild discrepancies.
And the Russian judge.
9.75, and the crowd thinks that is much too low.
It is much too low. She did a beautiful job, had much more difficulty, especially more than Nadia Comaneci. She ends with a double twist.
It does pivot us into this really interesting topic of agreement among judges, agreement about an outcome when the outcome is subjective.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of this inter-rater reliability is something that we don't even worry about in some of the sports, right? How far did the javelin go? I don't need 3 people looking at the javelin. It's something that is objective. But here, if the quality of a dive was something that was completely objective, we would just need one person calling out the score and it would be done and done. But it's not completely objective, right? There's a subjectivity to it. And so we try to get multiple raters, but it's so interesting whether or not those raters actually agree.
I've spent a lot of years working with undergrad college admissions, and it's very, very similar. What constitutes a high quality applicant? How do we measure it? And I got to tell you, there were days when I just wanted to pull down the blinds, get into bed, and pull the covers over my head. The complexities in making these determinations are just overwhelming.
Now, what we're talking about right now is just a nominal scale. It is 2 college evaluators going through 20 applications, and they're deciding whether that person should be admitted or not. And we want to know the extent to which those people agree. It might be 2 clinicians evaluating 20 patients on whether or not they think the patient has depression. And we're interested in knowing the extent to which those 2 clinicians agree. So far, this is just a nominal scale, and it's even binary. So if someone were to judge how consistent we are, an obvious thing to do would be just to compute our percent agreement. Hey, we agreed 86% of the time on whatever the thing is that we're evaluating. And that's a very straightforward way to measure inter-rater reliability or inter-rater agreement on what it is we're talking about. But it also has a problem. And the way I like to think about it is if you and I each flipped a coin 20 times, we're going to get the same flip a bunch of times just by chance. And one of the problems with percent agreement is that it just takes overall agreement into account. And you would expect that a certain number of times you and I are just going to line up even randomly. This is something that our friend Cohen figured out many decades ago and proposed a measure that corrects for chance agreement. He referred to it as kappa, and now historically it's Cohen's kappa. Rather than thinking about it as an overall percentage of agreement, it's an adjusted percentage of agreement that takes into account those chance occurrences. So it basically just rescales things. It's like someone who took a 100-item true-false test and they got a 50. We wouldn't be especially impressed. So the idea of Cohen's kappa is more to rescale things from the realm of chance on up rather than just overall agreement.
What I love about Cohen's kappa is we just live our lives in these contingency tables. Because if you get your head around that binary 2x2 grid where those cell counts are being adjusted, as Greg describes, for chance, then just put that as a lens and think about, I have 20 college applications and I have 2 readers. What is the agreement in the decisions of admit or not admit? And it's exactly the same thing.
Right. And this particular index ranges all the way from -1, which would mean Patrick and I are in complete disagreement, to +1 on the other end, where we are in complete agreement. Now, obviously, we tend to want values that are on the positive end. A bunch of different people have articulated what they think criteria for those might be. Some people will say, well, if you hit a Cohen's kappa of 0.75, you're doing pretty well with your raters agreeing. Some say that 0.9 is a gold standard. Others say, well, there is a confidence interval around it. And you and I usually land on, for the answer to just about everything, is it depends, right? It depends on what the purpose is, how important the decision is that's being made. But it's a very clever start to trying to understand about inter-rater agreement and reliability at the simplest level.
And that's what I really like, is it's a good starting place. Because those cutoff values and trying to determine what is good or not good or acceptable or unacceptable are no different than what happens with coefficient alpha. A reliability among a set of continuously scaled items is 0.9 good. Well, most people would say, yeah, hey, that's not bad. 0.8, 0.75. My favorite is when you're reviewing an article and they say that our alpha obtained was 0.595, which is broadly conceived as appropriate, right? As the cutoff is put like 100th of a point below whatever the obtained value is. But it doesn't bother me that there's subjectivity in, well, what is acceptable or not? Because in a way, we may have an acceptable level that varies depending on the outcome. So if it is for a college application, that's a really challenging thing to do that takes in myriad information that itself is subjective. What do you want to value? What do you want to upweight? What do you want to downweight? You might have a different acceptable cutoff than, say, you're doing an evaluation for, is a biopsy cancerous or not? I used to think in those biopsies that those were very objective and there was some AI machine that read it and spit out a red card or a green card until I met an oncologist and they were like, yeah, no, we have measures, but there's a huge subjective element as to whether that is cancerous or not. So what your cutoff is totally depends on what it is that you're studying. But what I like is the assignment of a numerical value that reflects the extent to which you and I agree about the outcome.
And you say you and I, the context that we talk about college admissions, not decided by just two people. The quality of a dive, the quality of a floor routine in gymnastics, not just decided by two people. The idea of this Cohen's kappa assessment extends out to having more than two raters. Someone named Fleiss extended Cohen's kappa out, and it's now called Fleiss's kappa. But it's similar principles, and you'd like to think that when you get more raters, you're sort of homing in on a better assessment of what's going on. But the idea behind it is very simple. If we had a third rater come in, Jiffy came in and was rating some of the...
I'm sorry, Jiffy is reviewing college applications?
I'll tell you what, I bet Jiffy would do at least as good a job as a lot of people in that room.
Yeah.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Jiffy.
Hey, Jiff.
I think I would do a pretty good job.
We do too, buddy. But anyway, it would just be a question of, all right, what's the agreement between you and me? What's the agreement between you and Jiffy? What's the agreement between me and Jiffy? Which tends to be pretty high. It's like he's in my head. Anyway, you just extend this out usually to all possible pairs, and then you wind up aggregating across all of the different combinations and adjusting for chance. So the principle at work here extends out to having multiple raters, and it gives you a sense then of how much concordance, to use a term we'll encounter in just a bit, how much concordance there is among all of the people who are doing the rating. But we're still in this binary, this nominal kind of world. A lot of times, we're not just saying yes or no, right? Depression, not depression, admit or not admit. We might be doing something that has multiple ordered categories. So if we take admissions, for example, we could have someone who is a clear don't admit, someone who is a clear admit, but then someone who's sort of in between those two things as a wait list kind of candidate. So now we have three categories on an ordinal scale. Patrick goes through all the applications and evaluates them, 1, 2, 3, or admit, don't admit, wait list. I go through and do that. And now we have to judge the extent to which we are in agreement, the extent to which there's reliability between us.
One really big component on this is independence of ratings is huge. I'm a reader. I'm unsure about my rating. And so I walk into your office and I say, hey, buddy, wake up. Some of us are working around here.
I'm on sabbatical. Leave me alone.
Exactly. Why are we even doing this? We're on sabbatical. God. Oh, wait, we don't get paid for it either way, so.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I walk in and I say, hey, Hancock, do me a favor. I'm borderline on this one. I ranked it as waitlist. Would you tell me if you agree or not? I tell you what my rating is, and then 90% of the time you come back and say, yeah, I agree, it's waitlist. Now, if it was you and me, we'd have a negative 0.9 because you'd come back in and say,
whatever you say, I'm going to say something different.
Idiot, exactly. But the other one that's really interesting about these undergrad admission examples, when we have a 2x2 with a binary outcome, our agreement are on the diagonals. Reject, reject, accept, accept. And then the disagreement is just one of us says one and the other one says the other. But the 3x3, you actually can think about gradations of disagreement. Technically, the agreement is on the diagonal. Admit, admit, waitlist, waitlist, reject, reject. Great, that's what we aspire to. But you and I can be one cell off, or we can be two cells off. And you can think about this as these kind of border conditions. So maybe I say admit and you say waitlist. All right, well, those are a disagreement, but they're adjacent. I could say admit and you could say reject. Well, that's actually a further distance in what you and I decided. So technically we disagreed, but there are gradations of the extent to which we disagreed.
And that kind of gets at the distinction between agreement and reliability. I mean, if you take this out to absurdity, right? Imagine we were evaluating each applicant on a 1 to 10 scale. And how often are we going to agree? Almost not at all, but close counts. And so how would we take close into account in an ordinal scale? There is something Cohen proposed that has come to be called Cohen's weighted kappa. And it's the same idea where it takes into account agreement, but it also offers weight where if you and I, let's call this scale 1, 2, 3. If you and I are a 1 and a 3, that's really far apart. If you and I are 1 and a 2 or a 2 and a 3, then we don't get penalized as much for our disagreement. So the weights have to do with how far apart we are along this ordinal scale. I like that because it is acknowledging that farther apart is worse and closer is something that happens. So that's a nice thing. And this also has extensions to having multiple raters as well.
What I really like about that is you are adjusting your numerical estimate to reflect the design as opposed to manipulating the responses to get back to the binary case. A lot of people aren't familiar with the weighted kappa. What I've seen a lot in practice is let's stick with the same example of accept, waitlist, reject. People will argue, well, a wait list really is an accept. You're saying they're above threshold. And so we say, we're going to treat admit and wait list as the same.
Right.
And then we're back to our Cohen's kappa. Don't do that, because the whole thing is that the wait list is itself a unique decision, and we need to represent that in the contingency table and then adapt our numerical estimate to reflect that 3x3 contingency.
Let's make things even more complicated.
But
wait, there's more. Let's imagine we have a scale that is, for all intents and purposes, interval. So maybe you and I watch 20 mothers interacting with newborn infants, and we have a scale that goes 1 to 10, and we have to evaluate the warmth of those new mothers' interactions with their infants. So essentially an interval scale. Or you and I are in classroom settings evaluating aggressive behavior of particular children. Now, if we had 20 mothers with their infants or 20 kids exhibiting aggressive behavior that we evaluated, what would be your inclination for how to assess whether or not we have inter-rater reliability?
Well, my initial hankering would just be to correlate the scores.
I like that hankering.
Yeah, it's say, they correlate 0.8. That's pretty high reliability. And importantly, what that means then is, we don't have to send 2 observers to every classroom. We can just send 1, because we know if we sent 2, they'd give almost the same, right? That's very common in how the designs are done. I'm part of a study where kindergartners are observed in classrooms and the teachers' interactions with the kindergartners are observed because of budget constraints, only have one observer go to each classroom. But for a random subset, they sent 2 to establish inter-rater reliability. And the motivation was, is if you can demonstrate it's high enough, that indicates that 1 is okay. Right. If you send another one, it's just redundant information and we don't need to do that.
And oftentimes in those kinds of studies, you will have that kind of check occur at multiple points throughout the study just to come in and see, are things still okay? Are things still okay? Are things still okay? So yeah, Pearson's correlation is an obvious way to go. Sometimes people will use a Spearman correlation if they're less certain about the interval properties of those things. And this is just, as you and I are talking about, is just for a system with 2 raters. If we had more raters, the word concordance comes into play from Kendall. Kendall came up with what's essentially a non-parametric. It's sort of like adapting a Spearman correlation to be able to have multiple raters. How much are we as a group of raters in accord with each other? So this extends out. It makes me think about ANOVA.
You always have to bring it back to ANOVA, don't you?
I know that people are kind of down on ANOVA and want to frame things in terms of a general linear model and all of that. I get it. But ANOVA really is useful for thinking about things. And frankly, it handles some things, I think, just more clearly. So let's imagine that we have a situation where there are multiple kids to be evaluated. What was the example you were using in classrooms evaluating?
The interaction between teacher and children. The motivating question was, to what extent did the teacher work to help the kids develop memory strategies?
I don't know what your outcome scale is for that. Let's assume it's something that we can treat as though it's interval. So we have some number of kids, and we can think about kids going down the left side, defining our data. And then going across the top as the columns, there are your ratings of each of those kids' interactions with the teacher. There are my ratings, and there are a host of other raters. And you might say, well, we would never do something like that in this particular study. All right, well, let me change the context then to there are 100 essays that are being evaluated, and we have a group of 10 raters going across the top as being the different raters who are evaluating those essays, like AP exams or something like that. So this two-way kind of framework holds for a lot of things that we think about, where we have the objects being rated going down the left side and the raters providing those ratings going across the top. So we have a design for ourselves right here. This we can think about as a general framework for reliability. I would imagine that you encounter this a lot in your work, something called the intra-class correlation coefficient.
I love this because the classic way people think about an intra-class correlation, as they should, is out of a traditional multi-level model. So you have students nested within classrooms, and you have multiple classrooms, and you give the students a math test, and you have a total variability across the math scores across all the kids, and you can break that down into the proportion that's within class, the proportion that's between class. You can take the ratio of between to total. You can interpret that in a couple of ways. Of the total variability in math scores, what proportion is due to between classroom differences? The one that I like and is linked to the name intra-class correlation, whatever the value is, the model implied estimate of how correlated will scores be for kids who share the same classroom. That is the intra-class correlation. However, one of my heroes in the field is Pat Schrout.
Yeah, good guy.
He and I actually were at a conference. There was some fancy pants dinner we were going to. It was in upstate New York. He drove, I rode with him, and we got in this really wonderful conversation about something, and we both realized that we were in the middle of nowhere, and we had driven 45 minutes past the dinner place, and we looked at each other, and we were having so much fun talking, and we so little wanted to go to the organized dinner. We stopped at a roadside diner and then just went back to the hotel. So Pat is a lovely human being, but he has a paper on, is it 10 different interpretations?
Something like that. Yeah, 9 or 10 different ways that you can cook up an ICC depending on stuff.
And one of the depending on things is exactly what you described. We can use the intra-class correlation to decompartmentalize these variance estimates in an ANOVA-like framework to get a sense of the inter-rater reliability.
The way that I think about the ICC in the context of intra-rater reliability, there is a total amount of variance in the system of the scores that we're interested in. And some of that variance is due to individual differences in whatever the heck we're rating, whether it's teacher interaction with students or quality of dives or whatever the thing is we might be evaluating. And then there's also this other noise that comes into the system, this noise that comes in from the fact that raters don't behave completely consistently. Raters can be very different from each other, right? So there's noise in those scores also. So the ICC can be thought of as the proportion of the total variance that's attributable to the variability in the persons who are actually being rated. But how we estimate that proportion of variance depends sort of on what our goals are here. And as Patrick alluded to, there are a whole bunch of different flavors of ICC, but here are a couple of things that will go into this. One is, we've got all these kids who are being evaluated, for example. If our study only wanted to generalize to those kids, then we could think of those kids as almost constituting this fixed element of the particular design. We don't usually think about things that way, right? We usually think about kids as being a sample from some population of kids. So that variability has its own uncertainty associated with it. The issue also applies to raters. If I have 6 raters who are providing ratings across all kids, so we're thinking about this right now as a completely cross design, are those all the raters that I care about? For this particular study, the answer might be yes. But if I'm providing an assessment of internal consistency as a process that we're doing in this study, and we could have done this study with different raters, with different kids, all of that. If we think about these raters as being a random sample of raters from some universe of potential raters, then raters isn't necessarily a fixed effect anymore, but it becomes a random effect as well, because we would like to generalize our process across all possible raters that we could get, not just these 6 raters. So some of the different flavors of ICC depend on what you're treating as fixed, what you're treating as random, and how broadly you wish to generalize your assessment of that intra-rater reliability.
And what I love about that is your emphasis on, well, we might want to generalize to a population of raters because there's sometimes you might not. So if you're a 17-year-old kid and you're about to submit your college application in the fall, you're writing essays, or ChatGPT is writing essays for you.
Sure, I can help you with that. I believe the most influential event in my life that has made me into the person I am today was when I saved, insert type of animal here, from the, insert dangerous situation here.
You want to have confidence that those are going to be evaluated by readers that are not unique to that particular kid. That if you were to do a thought experiment and have another sampling of readers, your essay would be similarly evaluated from any random draw from that population of readers. But what's fascinating about, say, the diving competition, there are 5 judges in the Olympics. Those are constant for whatever the event is. So there's the 1 meter, the 3 meter, the platform, the synchronized. But whatever it is, let's say there's the 3 meter springboard. All the athletes compete on the 3 meter springboard, but they hold the judges constant. In that case, sure, you might be interested in, well, what if these were sampled from a universe of judges? But for the 2024 Olympics in Paris, these are the 5 judges. And the thinking is if you have one person who really values a particular characteristic, right, is like ripping the dive, let's say. I didn't realize this till Christy got into diving. I thought that was a colloquialism that, oh, you ripped that dive meant you just did a really good job. In diving, it actually means something. A ripped dive is a diver puts their hands in and pulls the water apart and their head goes in to that. And that's why there's not a splash by a perfectly executed dive.
I think probably the coolest thing in diving is the rip entry. It's like shooting out of a barrel because it just rips you underwater really fast. when you're spinning in the air, you're going 35 miles an hour head first out the water. You push the water for your body to enter, and you hear just that crashing rip.
Isn't that fascinating?
Fascinating, yeah.
Let's say one judge particularly values that. Well, they're going to value that for all the divers on the 3-meter spring. So you're not generalizing to a population of judges. So it depends on the application of which of these that you're interested in.
So in addition to the stuff that Trout has written, there's a very nice summary article. It's a little old now, but I still think it's applicable. It's by McGraw and Wong in 1996. And this paper has a connection to you.
Uh-oh.
You might not know it until this moment.
I was not a reviewer on it, was it?
So no. Your connection to McGraw and Wong 1996 is that appeared in the very first issue of the very first volume of the journal Psychological Methods. You had a paper in the very first issue of the very first volume of Psychological Methods, and I think you were just a little bit grumpy that you...
I am still bitter.
Yeah.
I am still bitter about that. My paper is the second article in the journal. That's how close I was to being the first paper in the first issue of the first volume, and I still go to bed angry about that.
I'm going to make you feel a little bit better. McGraw and Wong was third.
All right.
So you were ahead of the McGraw and Wong paper.
Yeah, doesn't make me feel better at all.
Come on, silver medal.
It's bullshit. Go big or go home.
That's a great paper that tries to pull together a lot of these issues, and folks can check it out. What we're also dancing around here a little bit is that this whole reliability enterprise can be thought of from a model kind of perspective. Now, you and I think about damn near everything from a model kind of perspective, but once we start casting things in ANOVA, for example, that is a model-based way of thinking about these things, right? It's not just pushing the Cohen's kappa button, it's framing it within a design. And you've done some work that talks about reliability from a broader modeling perspective, right?
Well, if you mean I've done some work, meaning my usual, I stuck my name on a paper that Bauer wrote, then absolutely.
Yeah, no, we've met.
In that collaboration with Dan Bauer, we developed what we came to call the trifactor model. The trifactor just simply came from a generalization of the bifactor, right? If the bifactor is good, well, the trifactor must be 50% better. I mean, obviously. But before getting into a description of it, I want to pan back a little bit. We started super simple. You and I evaluate college applications and do we admit or not admit. Then a little more complicated is we have 3 levels. All right, so we're kind of working up. All of these that we've done to this point are still centered around this notion that there's some kind of truth, and we want to understand to what extent do we agree on the presence or absence or degree of that truth. But we can wiggle it a little bit and say, well, what if we took all of these same concepts and instead of having some truth that we're trying to agree about, we move from inter-rater reliability to multiple reporter. And that's what we were working on. It sounds an awful lot the same, but there's kind of a critical difference. Let's say that you and I have a kid together. We want to know the level of depressive symptomatology in our child. I'm given 10 items to assess our child's behavior, and you're given 10 items to assess our child's behavior, the very same 10 items. This looks an awful lot like what we've been talking about up until this point. And then we find out that our 2 ratings correlate 0.3, right? And we say, oh my God, were you even referring to the same child? That's not a made-up number. Is over decades, there's been parent report on child behavior and correlations of 0.3 and 0.4, and people have wrung their hands and they've talked about bias. You can generalize the question, is it inter-rater reliability of you and me reporting on our child, or is it a multiple reporter of a target behavior, the behavior of our child, that is also characterized by our perspective. So I have a perspective, you have a perspective, and those may be quite different, but not because it's unreliable, but because maybe you and I have different parenting roles, or we see them in different contexts, or we have different expectations for what is a lot if you're talking about a behavioral problem. So we can pivot into a really interesting question about, can we improve the evaluation of some behavior by not having just a single reporter, but by having multiple reporters? But holy crap, are we off to the races with added complexities?
So it's more about our respective perspectives on these kinds of things, right? Because I see our kid in a particular way because you always get to be like Disneyland dad, good cop dad, and I always have to do the discipline. My perspective is as someone who is really trying to shape our child and their moral compass, and you just want to have a good...
Do you feel better now?
Sorry. Anyway, so the point is that our perspectives may be different because the contexts in which we have these interactions are different. Just as if we brought a teacher into this mix and whatever is being evaluated, the teacher is observing these kinds of things in a different setting as well. So this becomes less about the need for a formal alignment of what we are all looking at and more about how we are all trying to offer perspectives on this particular phenomenon.
And what Dan and I took exception to early on was the decades-long focus on what was perceived as bias. That is, there's a parent report and a teacher report, and they correlate 0.2, so one of the reporters is biased. So I have twins. It was cheaper to have a nanny than to send them to daycare. But as they were getting close to kindergarten, we decided, okay, they don't know how to interact with anyone other than themselves. We probably should throw them into the Shark Tank so that they can figure out these social aggression skills early on. So we sent them to pre-K, and we had our very first parent-teacher meeting. Everything was fine. They're eating paste fine. They're cutting things and taping them back together fine. One of my kids had some temper tantrums. And I said, well, how are you dealing with the temper tantrums? Are those disruptive at all? And the teacher looked puzzled and said, well, what temper tantrums? Me being me, my immediate internal reaction was, dude, at least know which kids you're talking about. And she said, I'm sorry, we've seen no evidence of that. And I leaned back and I thought, really? Is it bias or is there a context effect? Where there is a behavior in the home and there is a behavior at school, and that is confounded with parent and teacher report. And that was the genesis of this work. Why we did these models was we were doing an integrative data analysis. IDA is you pull together independent data sets and pool them and then fit models to the pooled data set. But we had this very complicated situation where the reporters varied by contributing study. So a couple of studies had parent report, one study had a parent and an adolescent report, and one study had teacher report. And we were just like, oh, great. Now what the heck do we do with that? But like all IDA stuff, it generalizes much more broadly. Very briefly, because there could be a whole episode in this alone. Picture in your mind's eye, and yes, I know this is an audio format, a path diagram. And let's say there are 10 items of child behavior. So in the last 30 days, to what extent has your child done this, that, and the other? All right, so I fill out those 10 items for our child. Greg fills them out for our child, and the teacher fills them out for our child. Exactly the same 10 items. So now we have 10 items and 3 reporters with a shared target. All right, the trifactor part is we can go old school Spearman and have a common factor. There's a single latent variable that all 30 items load on. My 10, your 10, the teacher's 10. And that is what we think about as the common factor. That's what we're really after. We want the most reliable and valid assessment of the child's behavior. All right, that's factor 1, the common factor. Now we have a second layer of factors that are called perspective factors. So my 10 load on a factor, your 10 load on a different factor, and the teacher's 10 load on the teacher factor. So we have 3 perspectives. That's the second level. And then the third level is each of us responds to the same set of items, so there's a specific factor. is if I say in the last 30 days to what extent has little Johnny broken toys that belong to someone else. Well, I filled that item out. You filled that item out. The teacher filled that item out. So those 3 items load on the specific factor. That's where the term trifactor came from. There's a common factor, perspective factors, and specific item factors. And then we could talk for half an hour about things that you could do with it. But the key thing we wanted was to use the factor model to get factor scores on that common factor that we then took to other analyses.
That has all the pieces that you need right there to be able to cook up some of your own measures of reliability, because you have this parsing of the whole covariance matrix into these different sources. So there's probably some really cool stuff to continue along those lines on.
And we did a bit of just talking about the variance of the common factor, the variance of the perspective factors, the variance of the specific, although we did not formally develop that into a numerical metric of reliability. So if somebody's looking for a project, that would be a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, so if someone wants Dan Bauer to write that and to add their name to it.
No, that's my intellectual sugar daddy. You leave that one alone.
So the purpose of today's episode, yes, we have one, is...
Wait, what?
No, I know. It's something we're trying out in season 6. So anyway, the idea is that we often need to measure things that are not entirely objective, and so we need the perspectives of multiple people. Then the interesting question is, how well do those people agree? How internally consistent are those individuals? What we've talked about today is a way to try to think about that from the crudest level, when the decisions we're making are binary, all the way to more sophisticated systems that might have interval measures, tapping constructs with multiple raters, and all of that. So it's a very cool area.
So uncharacteristic for us, it seems like we have a point and this is a good place to wrap up. Would you agree?
No, actually. Are you just trying to get in the last word like you all?
Dude, we're at 72 minutes on the recorder. You promised me we would not go past 60.
Yeah, I didn't go past 60. You were the one.
Okay, buddy,
yeah.
This is an objective outcome that we are both observing, and we hit the 60-minute mark 12 minutes ago.
Yeah.
Are you disagreeing on that?
Who's been doing most of the talking in those 12 minutes? I think that's an objective measure we can go back and check.
Help me. Help me.
You see what I'm dealing with, people? Do you see what I'm dealing with every day?
Take care, everybody.
See ya. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening. You can subscribe to Quantitude on Apple, Spotify, Google, or listen to us on your local NPR station. Okay, that's a total lie. Sorry, we just watched the presidential debate. And please leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter, X, or Blue Sky. We are at Quantitude Pod. And check out our webpage at quantitudepod.org for searchable playlists, show notes, a syllabus that organizes episodes under class topics, and other cool stuff. Finally, instead of getting a 12-foot-tall skeleton from Home Depot 2 months before Halloween, decorate your yard with awesome Quantitude-themed merch at redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized products go to donors choose to support low-income schools. You have been listening to Quantitude, resulting in a Cohen's kappa of 1.0 when 2 independent raters both say, "Seriously? That's an actual podcast?" Quantitude is brought to you by additional variations of kappa for everyday life. The sigma kappa, more commonly known as the spousal kappa, is a numerical measure of agreement between 2 partners as to the equitable division of household labor. Although mathematically bounded between -1 and +1, no positive value has ever been obtained in practice. The kappa kappa, more commonly known as the kid kappa, this is a numerical measure of agreement between parent and child assessing the extent to which there was a shared understanding that it was never formally stated that no member of the family was allowed to skateboard on the roof. This is often computed while waiting in the ER for the X-ray technician to arrive. And finally, the sigma eta phi lambda alpha upsilon gamma tau 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 rho mu delta kappa, more commonly known as the seriously, how long are you going to take to return my draft kappa? This is a historically highly contested measure of agreement between student and advisor as to how long an advisor said they will take to return a student's draft of a manuscript. No empirical estimate has yet to be computed for this measure, as we are still waiting for the advisor to reply to our email. This is most definitely not NPR.